All right, everybody, welcome to the third and last part of plant transport. So we talked about the path of water, the uptake of water into the roots and minerals. Now we're going to talk about transpiration and also what's called translocation. So translocation is the transport of sugars, and we're going to look at that a little bit later. But we're going to start by talking about transpiration. So transpiration is the loss of water from a leaf due to evaporation. So in a first step, the water, remember that it's transported up through the xylem and it gets into the leaves, and suddenly there's a lot of water in the leaves. Yeah, so what happens, some of it is used for photosynthesis, but the water that isn't used, it will evaporate into these big air spaces that we find in the spongy mesophyll, and then it will leave the leaf through the stomata by diffusion. So transpiration, that's a definition which is going to come up in the next slide as well, so you can copy it from there, is the loss of water from a leaf due to evaporation. Then there is a phenomenon that we're going to talk about, which is the transpiration pull. What is going to be pulled? It's the water that is going to be pulled through the xylem vessels. Now, one observation, of course, if the plant loses too much water, that will decrease its turgor pressure inside the cell that we've been talking about, then it will begin to wilt, and we have to prevent that. In order to prevent water loss, plants will close their stomata if, for instance, it is very hot, dry, or sunny outside. Yeah, so under those conditions, plants would tend to lose water, and then they close their stomata to preserve the water inside their leaves. So here's your definition with a little pencil symbol so that you can copy it down. Transpiration is the loss of water from a leaf, and that in particular it's the surface of mesophyll cells due to evaporation. And on the right hand side I've shown you pictures again of how the water moves through the plant. On the bottom picture it enters the root, and the middle picture it is moved up through the xylem, and on the top picture it enters the leaves. And here this arrow on the right hand side next to the tree, it shows you how the water potential varies throughout all of these places. So at the root cells, don't really, don't worry about the units, but basically the water potential is higher at the root hair cells than in the stem, higher in the stem than in the leaf, higher in the leaf than in the atmosphere. And since you know that water moves from a high water potential to a low water potential, this means that the water is going to move from the root into the stem, into the leaves, and into the atmosphere. Okay, so that is the transpiration flow, if you will. Now what happens if water, so really to understand this we have to think from the top of the tree. What happens if water leaves the leaves through the stomata? Yeah, so water leaves the xylem vessels. What happens? Well, where it leaves, it needs to be replaced. And what can it be replaced by? It can be replaced by water from the stem xylem. Yeah, so water lost from the xylem in the leaves will be replaced by water that comes from the xylem in the stem. So it's kind of pulled up. Yeah, you pull at one end, and there's a whole. You can almost imagine it as a column of water molecules, and you pull on that column, and because water is lost at the top, and that creates a pull, which is the transpiration pull that I was mentioning earlier, and this pull draws up water through the xylem of the stems. And if that leaves, it is also being replaced. What is it being replaced by? It's being replaced by water from the xylem in the roots. And if that water leaves, it is being replaced by water from the soil that is taken up by the root hairs. So this whole thing is really, it's in movement because you remove things at the top. And so where you remove something, something is being replaced. Yeah? Hopefully that idea is clear. So ultimately you've got the water loss through the leaf, and I've shown something similar earlier, but here it is again. So very important, what happens is that you've got the water coming from the xylem vessels, as shown by the blue arrows, and then any water that isn't used for metabolic purposes, that means for photosynthesis mainly, it sort of accumulates here in these cell walls. Yeah, so the cell walls are a little bit like blotting paper. It's kind of the same material, yeah, because blotting paper is obviously made from these very same plant fibers. And so you can imagine that the water sort of, it's sucked up by this blotting paper-like substance that is the cellulose in the cell walls. And then at some point, when there's a lot, it will evaporate. So at this point here, where you see this arrow, or here, the water will evaporate out of the cell wall into the airspace. It makes a lot of sense that the water does that because there's far less water in the airspace than there is in the cell walls. So the water tends to go where there is less of it. We know this already. Yeah, so the water will evaporate into this airspace. And then it turns out that now, like I said earlier, there is no cell membrane here across the stoma. So we're not calling this osmosis, we're now calling it diffusion, yeah, because the water particles, they move just like any other particles. And through that movement, they tend to go where there's less of it now, and there's usually less water vapor in the outside atmosphere than inside the air pockets within the spongy mesophyll. And so that means that the water is now going to diffuse out of the stomata. Yeah, so transpiration really consists, at the level of the leaf, it consists of two things, and one is evaporation, step one, and then diffusion through the guard cells. Yeah, that is important for you to understand. First the water evaporates, and then when it's water vapor, it will then diffuse through the guard cells to the outside. There are various factors that affect the transpiration rate of a plant. That is how much a plant transpires. The most important ones are temperature and humidity. And here again, I've got the pencil, so take your time to copy this down into your biology book. When the temperature is high on a warm day, that increases the transpiration rate because diffusion, remember we had said that diffusion, and in this case, water diffuses out of the leaf, and diffusion is faster when the temperatures are higher. Yeah, so when the day is warm, the plant will transpire more, and any gardener can tell you that that is true. Yeah, so your plant is more prone to wilting if it is really hot outside, and that's the reason. The other factor is the humidity in the air. Now it turns out if the air is very humid, that means that there is a lot of water in the air already, a lot of water vapor. And that means that the concentration difference between the inside of the leaf, remember in the air pockets of the spongy mesophyll, and the outside air is not particularly big. And that will slow down the transpiration rate. Yeah, because any time that the concentration difference is not particularly high, we won't have a high rate of diffusion. And in this case, that means if we don't have a high rate of diffusion, we don't have a high rate of transpiration either. So if you have plants in a very humid room, you will notice that they, even if it's warm, you will notice that they wilt less fast than plants that you keep somewhere where it is very dry. Now let's look at these four leaves. And this is, now here we haven't changed the humidity, we haven't changed the temperature, but we can still ask ourselves where will transpiration happen at the highest rate. Yeah, so this is basically introducing additional factors or additional adaptations that the plant itself can do so that it loses less water. Yeah, will it be leaf A, leaf C, leaf B, or leaf D? Well, you can stop the video and think for a while to see how you would organize these in order of water loss. I'm now going to tell you the solution. So the leaf that loses water the fastest is leaf B. Why? Well, leaf B has a stoma in its upper epidermis. Now, why is that a problem, or why does that mean that the leaf will lose a lot of water? Well, because it is directly exposed to the sun. So the top side of the leaf, the upper epidermis, will heat up more than the lower epidermis. And where there is more heat, there will be more diffusion. Where there is more diffusion, there will be more transpiration. So leaf B is particularly susceptible to losing water via transpiration. The next one is leaf D, because leaf D too has two stomata. Now they're both on the underside of the leaf, so it's a little bit more protected, but at the same time it still has more than leaf C, so it's going to lose more water than leaf C. So here the factor is the number of stomata. So leaf C is doing a better job at leaf D than at keeping the water vapor inside. And finally, we have leaf A. Now leaf A is even better at keeping water inside. How come? Well, because it has, as you may see, at the top it has a thick waxy cuticle. And that means that even less water will be able to leave that leaf. So a waxy cuticle is also an adaptation to try and stop water loss. And we only have that at the upside of the leaf because it is the top side of the leaf that is particularly exposed to the hot sun. Yeah, so we have several adaptations on the part of the plant to avoid losing a lot of water. Well, the first one that isn't even shown here is that, of course, the stomata can close. Then we have the position of the stomata, where at leaf B it's at the top, and we don't really find that in plants. And the number of stomata as well, which, you know, plants that live in very dry area, they tend to have fewer stomata per square centimeter, for instance. And then you also have the thickness of the waxy cuticle, which, again, if a plant is adapted to really dry conditions, it will have a thick waxy cuticle so as not to lose a lot of water. Now, different question, but very related. So I've loosely talked about the fact that water gets replaced. If you pull at the top, you have this column of water, and where you pull at the top, it will the water that you pull out will be replaced, coming from the bottom. But how does this, how do they stick together is really the question. So there are several things that are sticking here. Yeah. So on the right-hand side, you see some water molecules, and you really don't have to fully grasp, the chemical details of this here. But basically, it turns out that water molecules, they're a little bit charged, and you may know that charges, positive and negative charges, they attract each other, and so it turns out that basically water molecules, they stick together. That is a basic characteristic of water, which accounts for a lot of its properties and how it behaves. But anyway, that's as much as you have to know about this. You don't have to know more about this. They stick together, and they also stick to the walls of the xylem vessel through something called adhesion. Sorry, I forgot to say that the sticking together of water molecules is called cohesion. Co is Latin, and it means together, and adhesion also comes from Latin. Ad means to something. So adhesion is the sticking of water molecules to the xylem vessels, and cohesion is the sticking of water molecules to each other. And so basically water molecules stick to the xylem and they stick together, and when water leaves the leaves through evaporation, these forces mean that water molecules can be drawn up just like a chain, like a chain of connected molecules, and they will not be that column will not be interrupted. So if you take it out at the top, it's going to be replaced from the bottom. Now, xylem cells have adaptations, and here again, this is something that you should copy. Adaptations are really important. I like to talk about adaptations because in biology, a lot of structures only make sense when you think about how they are adapted. We already talked about the adaptations of root hair cells. Now, xylem cells are also adapted to their task. So the first one is, I haven't even mentioned this one yet, or only implicitly, is that they don't have any cytoplasm. That is a good thing in their case, because that means that the water can move freely. Imagine having to make your way through the cytoplasm. No, really, this would be very difficult. So xylem cells, they're just like empty, hollow tubes because their cytoplasm has disappeared. Once they're finished differentiating, they have no cytoplasm. And like I've said several times already, they have no end wall, so the cells form a tube. And finally, I've mentioned this in, I think, part 1 of this lesson. The walls of the xylem vessel are strengthened with something called lignin, which is waterproof, so the vessels won't leak. Now, this this you are already familiar with. This is just a schematic representation. And this here is how you would see the xylem under the light microscope. So the xylem vessel is, there are several here, but let's see, this one you can see quite well. So the xylem vessel, it's delimited like this. I've actually lost my normal mouse, as in it's still next to me, but it's not working anymore. So now I'm doing this with a trackpad, which is even more interesting than just with a mouse. So there you go. This is your xylem vessel. And these red things here, they are ring-formed reinforcements of the cell wall. So they're not these cell walls here. I'm going back to the other picture here to show you that that's not what they are. Instead, they are ring reinforcement of the cell wall that runs down here. Yeah, so it's a little bit maybe confusing to look at, and it would be much better to do this together in class under a microscope, but there you go. Here you can see this is a young xylem vessel. Here it's called the protoxylem, and this here, these are cells that run next to the xylem vessels, and you can see that they do have these cell walls. Yeah, so they are not xylem vessels. So the big xylem vessels, they don't have these cell walls. Okay, and then we had talked quite a lot already about where the xylem runs. Yeah, so this is just to remind you that when we're in the root, the xylem will be in the middle in this X shape, and when we're in the stem, the xylem will be, the vascular bundles are on the outside of the stem, and the xylem will always be on the inside of these vascular bundles. Okay, now we finished talking about the transport of water and minerals, and we're going to spend just some time to talk about the transport of sugars and amino acids, which is called translocation. Here again, I guess I have said it several times already, but repetition can be useful. Sugars and amino acids as well are moved from source to sink. So source, again, where the materials are produced, usually the leaves, but not always, and the sink is the region that they are transported to. So that can be either up or down the stem of a plant. Water always only goes up, and sugars and amino acids can go either up or down. Sugars and amino acids are used for storage, as it were, but also importantly for respiration and growth. So it's very important that the plant can get them, or should be able to get them to all the parts of its body. Like I said earlier, leaves can be source and also sink because they do use molecules in their metabolic reactions. In particular, just as spring starts out, a tree that is, imagine a huge oak tree or a linden tree. Those can grow very tall and can have very impressive crowns. Imagine how many leaves they need to make to cover their crowns and leaves. And to kickstart that production, is very important that sugars that have been stored elsewhere in the tree should be able to be brought up there. Okay, so in that case, the leaf can also be a sink. Now, translocation, here's your definition for you to copy, is the movement of sugars and amino acids through the phloem sieve tubes of the plant. Sugars are transported from source to sink. So what are sieve tubes? Well, that's just a fancy word for phloem cells. Yeah, so just as the xylem forms these xylem vessels, the phloem is composed by living cells that are called sieve tube elements, and the whole vessel is called a sieve tube. Sieve because the end plates, these connections between the different elements, they are these ones here. They look like a sieve. That's why they're called sieve tube. And so up in the source cell, in this case it's a leaf cell, sugars are made through photosynthesis, and these organelles here, which hopefully you remember what they are called. Yes, you should know that these are chloroplasts, and the chloroplasts do photosynthesis and produce sugars. And these sugars, so the first direct product is, as we have learned, glucose. Jesus, excuse my terrible handwriting here. Glucose. And glucose is joined with another sugar called fructose, which is also made from glucose initially. And glucose and fructose make a disaccharide. They're monosaccharides, fructose and glucose, because they're just a single sugar unit. And these two together are called a disaccharide, and the disaccharide that they form together is called sucrose, and that's your table sugar. That is the form in which the plant transports sugar through its body. So the sucrose is then made in the source cell and the leaf cell. It goes into something called a companion cell, and then from there it's transported into the phloem. Now that actually needs a little bit of water for that transport as well, which is why the phloem is located next to the xylem, so it can draw on the water that flows through the xylem to dissolve the sugars that it makes, and those sugars are then transported to the sink, which frees up the water again, and the water basically just goes back into the xylem, and the sugar is imported into the sink cells. And in this case, our sink cell is a root cell. Okay, and this is these are the learning objectives according to the Cambridge syllabus, so the things that you should know. You should know both core and supplement. We're doing the supplement as well. And so I've written down the book sections again according to the edition that you've got. And so this is on the PDF slides that or on the PDF of the slides, I should say, that I've also uploaded to Google Classroom. So you should be able to print these out, make notes on them, etc., etc. Yeah, and you will have the learning objectives right there with them. This is the second half of the learning objectives. All right, guys, thanks for listening. I hope you found this useful, and I'm going to try and upload this onto Google Classroom now.